Hello and welcome. I am Camille Alamia, multimedia reporter for Rappler and your Newsbreak Chats host. This is our third episode for the year for 2021. And it's been a year already since the lockdown, quarantine due to the coronavirus pandemic. And it's like we're back to square one. COVID cases are rising, hospitals are operating at full capacity, and lockdowns everywhere. So for this episode, we decided to look into this issue. We will be joined by three of my co-reporters, Sofia Toma Cruz, who has been our go-to reporter for the pandemic. So kung merong mga czars ng Duterte government, we also have our own, and that's Sofia, our pandemic czar. We also have Rambo Talabong, who focuses on local government units, Ralph Rivas, our business reporter, and we are also fortunate to have with us Marites Vitug, Rappler's editor at large, to talk to us about the regional situation. So first, I want to ask Sophia, you're our pandemic czar in Rappler. How did we get here, or I think how come we're still here at this point after 1 year?
Right. Well, it's hard to pinpoint just one reason, no. But I think one thing that really encapsulates why we find ourselves in a situation that looks a lot like where we were last year, if not worse, is because we have unfortunately failed to take stock of the lessons that we should have learned from over the last year, whether that be I mean, of course, basically how to respond to the coronavirus and how to keep transmissions at bay. I think one thing that makes our situation this year a little bit more painful is the fact that we're not starting from scratch, or we shouldn't be starting from scratch. Whereas last year, when the pandemic took hold of the world, now everybody was saying nobody saw this coming. Nobody knew how to respond to this. What's extra painful now is the fact that we find ourselves in the same point, um you know already having gone through the entire year last year. And so it really begs the question for me, on what we've learned and if we have learned anything at all. So I think one reason why we see ourselves back here is precisely because of that. We either have failed to listen to and really truly listen to suggestions that our medical experts have made to make changes in our health infrastructure, long lasting changes, not just band aid fixes. And at the same time, I mean, I think we can all relate here when we say everybody's a little bit tired of the pandemic. For a while, we thought that we could go out and experience a little bit of freedom, albeit, covering wearing a face mask and everything. But there are new challenges as well, like the variants that have made its way here to the Philippines. So, you know, it just goes, it's exhausting, and it just goes back to that about not really learning from the lessons that we should have learned from in 2020.
Mother, what about you? Why do you think we're still here a year after?
Following up on what Sophia said about not learning lessons, it's also not learning the best practices from our neighbors. As we've seen, Vietnam has done very well. Same with Thailand. Um, and we did not learn from their experience. There has been a lot of literature, a lot of reports, but again, we did not look outside our shores, and by we I mean our leaders decided to just look at ourselves, be insular, and said we're excellent, we're doing this so well. So there's a lack of humility to accept that mistakes have been made, and there's a lack of humility to accept that there are lessons to be learned from other countries. So it really boils down again to leadership and the overused word competence. Does this government know what it's doing?
Mhm. Sophia, you've been talking to experts, to doctors. Ano ba, nakikita ba nila to na magtutuloy-tuloy or mas gagrabe ba compared last year?
Um, One thing particular about itong surge, itong current spike that we're seeing, especially in Metro Manila, is that unlike the last peak that took place nung July to August, kung naalala nyo yun, when the health workers called for a timeout to reassess our pandemic response, is that the way cases are growing this time around is much faster. And we all know that, and why researchers and experts are worried about the pace at which infections are spreading is because we know naman, di ba, na the coronavirus spreads exponentially. So it's not 1:1. The next day you can have really multiple number of cases. And I think from there, well, of course, yung mga experts and medical people who we talk to are always worried about making future projections and everything, are very focused on what we can do now. So, as we all know, the government has recently called for stricter restrictions again, a lockdown, but now called an NCR plus bubble. So, the way that infections will go will also really greatly depend on how well that bubble is implemented, and whether or not it can really cut transmission. But if it's not enough, as we don't know yet, but if it's not, if, like what mother said, if it's not done, if implementation is not done well, if it's not competent, then knock on wood, but we could see it, could drag on for longer or even get worse.
Any one of you can answer this question. Napag-uusapan natin lagi competence. But iniisip ko, kulang ba ng expert sa team na, alam mo yun, nag-handle ng issue na to? Bakit isang taon na and it's like nothing's changed? Kulang ba tayo ng doctors leading the way or something like that? Kasi all we've been seeing is like yung mga military, mga police officials.
Can I just cite one concrete example? Itong issue ng indemnity. Remember na delay tayo sa pag-order ng Pfizer because apparently our vaccine czar and his team of negotiators didn't realize that the vaccine manufacturer required indemnity. So this indemnity is known among vaccine experts, among those who work in pharma companies, among doctors. They know this. But how come there are 5 teams of vaccine experts in DOH? How come hindi nalaman ni vaccine czar Carlito Galvez Jr. na kailangan ng indemnity? As early as October last year, Singapore was talking about it. Nauna sila. They even had a webinar on indemnity. So bakit hindi alam? So siguro hindi nagko-communicate yung mga medical or vaccine health experts natin sa the people who are actually negotiating, these retired generals.
Mother, you mentioned like yung Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore. Where do we stand in Southeast Asia and the Asian region? And ano ba yung ginawa nila? Why they were able to successfully do it?
The common thread among those who have successfully contained the virus is, number 1, early response. Mabilis, nauna sila. They shut down their borders. They did contact tracing. Dito fascinating ang contact tracing sa Vietnam. Dito sa atin, 1:37 according to our contact tracing czar. For every one person who's exposed, they should be able to trace the 37 contacts. But we have not done that. I think we're only 1:7. I'm not sure of the figures now. But it's fascinating in Vietnam. They do 3 layers of contact tracing, meaning the first set of people the person was exposed to, and then the first set was exposed to a second set of people, then the second set was exposed to a third set. Grabe, ganun ka-extensive. And in fact, this is not done usually in other parts of the world. So, learning from that, early response, contact tracing. In the case of Thailand, the retired generals who are running the junta turned over the leadership of the corona response, crisis response to medical experts. Kaya nagkaroon ng effective response. At another fascinating thing with Thailand is they used I think 1 million village volunteers, the health volunteers that have been there since the 70s, which they copied from us, our barangay health program. Kinopya nila, yet they were able to use it successfully. Sila ang human contact tracers sa Thailand. So those are just 2 of the examples.
I just noticed lang, some of the countries that have good or excellent pandemic responses, Vietnam nga, Taiwan, and even Hong Kong, kahit na bumalik ulit yung mga several cases. So has their inherent distrust of China somehow worked to their advantage? Kasi yun nga, ang bilis nila nagsara ng borders eh.
Now, I think it's more their experience with SARS in 2002, 2003. Taiwan was traumatized by SARS. At the time, they had the most number of deaths in the world. So, natakot talaga sila. They learned their lessons. They built up their health system, their surveillance. So, nung end of December 2019, was it? When the virus was discovered in Wuhan, kaagad silang nag-shut ng borders nila. They stopped flights from China, especially from Wuhan. So I think it's that trauma from SARS. You know, we were fortunate during that time kasi we were spared. You know, I was looking at the World Health Organization report. We only had, I'm looking at it now, 12 cases of SARS in 2003 and dalawang reported deaths. Of course, SARS was more benign than coronavirus. And the World Health Organization praised the Philippines, saying that ang galing daw ng ating surveillance, ng contact tracing, all the regions were reporting daily, etc. So I think lessons from, we did not learn the lessons. Maybe I'm looking back, maybe we were complacent because we successfully hurdled SARS.
Or maybe it's the institution itself na alam mo naman dito, every administration na nagpapalit, hindi naman natin maaasahan na alam mo yon, the policies of the last administration will still be in place in the next administration. So now let's go to Rambo and Ralph. It seems now that the responsibility is with the local government units and yung mga companies sa private sector. Rambo, how are LGUs addressing the problems? And meron bang fear na baka at some point, like ito, pataas ng pataas yung cases, na maubusan na rin sila ng resources?
Ang gandang tanong mo, Camille, actually talagang ang mga LGUs going into 2021, kapos na sila sa budget. So yung pagpunta lang 2021, hindi na nila alam kung saan huhugutin yung pera kasi nahuhutom yung mga tao, walang trabaho. At ang gandang konteksto na sinabi ni Sofia kanina na naging optimistic tayo for a time, very. Actually, yung mga myths na naman nila, pitch, pwede bang gawing MGCQ, palawagin ang ating mga protocols para at least buksan ang ekonomiya, para magkaroon ng maayos na trabaho ng mga tao. Pero, ayun, lumalala ang sitwasyon at ngayon, napilitang kagad sila pigilan ulit ang mga taong pumasok, ang mga tao hindi pinapasimba, ahead of Holy Week pa, ang daming mangyayari kung kailan pwedeng maging booming ang business, dapat ang mga tao na maging booming ang virus. Pero ngayon, ang kinakaharap ng mga mayors, instead of them having that ideal na pwede na sanang magbukas ang ekonomiya nila, makapagbigay sila ng trabaho, ngayon napupuno na yung kanilang mga quarantine centers, mga hospital beds sa kanilang mga areas, hindi nila magagawin. Pati yung contact tracing nila, nakakapos din sila. Nabanggit kanina ni Mother na ang ideal natin talagang maraming layers of contact tracing, maayos. Pero yung mga mayors ngayon, nagtataka, tsaka nagugulat pa rin ngayon na bakit di maayos ang ating contact tracing. Idagdag niyo pa yung layer dyan na ang mga local government units gusto rin lang kumuha ng vaccine. Kasi may pera naman yung mga LGU sa Metro Manila, pero kumuha na rin sila ng mga kanilang kontrata para makakuha ng vaccine. Dahil ang national government, medyo mabagal yung kanilang procurement at open naman ang national government for the LGUs to procure on their own. So there's a lot of things happening for mayors now, for leaders, and this doesn't even count yung mga probinsya ngayon, di ba? As I mentioned here, that's worth noting is yung bubble. So talagang sinara ng national government itong area ng Metro Manila at saka 4 na probinsya na pumapaligid sa kanya. Pero ang mga LGUs din sa labas ng Maynila, takot din sila baka mapupunta sa kanilang virus. Pero itong bubble naman ngayon, malabo rin yung enforcement. Bigla na lang kasing niredraw ng national government ang borders ng NCR at saka nito mga probinsya. Kaya ang enforcement ng PNP medyo nalilito ang mga tao at hindi agad-agad nakascade yung bagong declaration na dapat GCQ na, dapat supposedly unimpeded daw yung travel within the bubble. Pero ang police, syempre, pupunta sila sa checkpoint nila at merong natural borders dyan for decades na ine-enforce. Kagulo yung enforcement on the first day at least. At may nagsasabi ng mga mayors na inaayos ng Duterte government little by little, but we're a year into this and we're seeing the same scenes. People are hungry. Local government units are desperate, especially barangay officials.
I'm just curious kasi I'm sure nakakausap mo yung mga mayors and local officers. Behind the scenes ba, meron silang sinasabi na sentiments na hindi nila pwedeng masabi on record? Syempre, fear of paghihiganti.
I think, Camille, the narrative here is really the tension of the national and the local. And you can already guess what their sentiments are. There are a lot of mayors who want to innovate. Meron mga kanya-kanyang contact tracing applications kasi hindi nila pinagkakatiwalaan yung contact tracing application ng government. Diba meron silang Safe Philippines, Safe Philippines for contact tracing. Pero meron silang innovations. Tapos just recently, may declaration ng national government na bawal kayong gumawa ng sarili niyong contact tracing app. Dapat centralized tayo. Pero bakit ngayon lang to sinasabi ng government kung kailan nakapag-innovate ng mga local government units? Tapos, itong pag-procure nga ng vaccines, para nauna na sila as compared to the national government. Tapos, dumating sa punto noong December na sinabihan yung mga mayors na huwag kayo mauna masyado sa national government. Remember na yung national government ang merong kapangyarihan mag-approve niyan. Tapos, we also have the enforcement, of course, the police. Kakasabi lang nung kahapon, 2 days ago or a few days ago na bagong rules. So the mayors had to adjust. Hindi mabilis yung cascading of information as usual. So this is a story that's been going on for the past year. Wala pa ring application, as Mother said, yung good practices. At these are lessons and sentiments na na-report na rin natin before, pero nakikita nating umuulit ngayon.
Ralph, about naman sa mga businessmen na nakausap mo. Interestingly, meron kasi isang story sinabi, di ba? Parang may isang businessman sinabi niya, yung government response, it's a shit show. And parang curious ako, ano pa iba niyang sinabi na hindi mo na isulat? Or hindi pwedeng masulat?
Siyempre, medyo juicy yung interview na yun. No? I didn't really expect na sasabihin yon ng isang business leader. Pero 3 things, no, Camille. The business community in general is confused. They're confused. 2, they want to take control. And 3, they're reaching their limits. Pagdating dun sa punto ng confused, no, kasi tandaan natin yung business community, sila itong nag-push na safely reopen. I don't know, pati yung economic team, meron silang tinatawag na quote-unquote dance with the virus. Gusto naman, di ba? So, who would want to dance with such a deadly virus, di ba? So, parang yung gusto sana nila is lumabas pa rin yung mga tao safely, may mga nakamask. Ang dami ng ginastos ng business community. Ang daming barriers, di ba? Tapos yung mga disinfection, kung pupunta ka ng salon, ang dami-daming mga kailangang suotin, di ba? Or halimbawa, I went to a dentist just a couple of weeks ago. May mga additional cost, meron ka ilalagay sa ulo. You know, ang dami ng precautions just for people to feel safe and confident to go out in public with their families and friends. But it turns out, hindi pa rin nangyayari yun kahit ginagawa na natin. Diba? So they realized actually last year pa na it's gonna be the vaccines that will bring back consumer confidence. Tandaan natin, sobrang bumagsak yung ekonomiya. Our GDP is still likely going to be negative this first quarter. So ganun kalala. Diba? So talagang yung mga negosyante gusto nila tayo na yung bumili mismo ng mga bakuna natin dahil medyo magulo na yung businesses. And also remember, the business community would like to keep business and politics separate. But it turns out this pandemic, you cannot do that. Di ba? Parang I think some businessmen are still trying to to reject that idea that they need to rely on government, and it turns out we don't have a very competent government, di ba? And tandaan natin, they're reaching their limits. Big companies, sobrang double-digit yung down ng earnings. Kung titingnan mo yung mga maliliit na negosyo, yung mga karinderya dyan, hindi na nagbubukas everyday. Halimbawa, yung karinderya na binibilhan ko ng ulam dito malapit sa condo, I think kung kailan na lang sila may kapital na konti, saka doon na lang sila nagbubukas. So ganun kalala yung economy right now.
It's so sad nga kasi kahit saan ka mapunta, kunwari lumabas ka lang, kahit nasa loob ka lang ng sasakyan, makikita mo talaga ang daming nagsasara na businesses, ang daming for rent ulit na syempre maraming umalis. Pero Ralph, this new rise in the number of cases, what can we expect? Lalong, 'di ba recession na tayo. So lalo pa ba? And at the same time, what about the people who lost their jobs? Marami pa bang taong mawawalan ng trabaho? Ano sinasabi ng mga experts on that?
Actually, the most optimistic or consensus, or I don't know what to call it anymore, no? Pero most likely babalik tayo sa 2019 levels natin ng economic growth by 2022 pa, the latter part, mga fourth quarter of 2022. But tandaan natin, our regional counterparts like, I don't know, Vietnam, Thailand, in Southeast Asia basically, they're expected to bounce back as early as this year. So, I mean, kung titingnan natin competitiveness, kung nakikipag-compete tayo for investments, that's gonna spell trouble. Banggitin ko lang, no, there are 4 million Filipinos who were unemployed as of January 2021, according to the PSA. This is actually higher. I mean, higher than the 3.8 million unemployed in October 2020. So ano nangyari doon? 'Di ba? More people have gotten back into the labor force because they need money. Tapos ano ngayon, ang dami nagsasara. So it's gonna be with these high cases, nakita na yung before pa nga nung medyo sa tingin natin nagfa-flatten, quote and quote, no? Business confidence did not come back. The jobs barely came back. It was the numbers reported, the January 2021 employment figures are very disappointing. So talagang doble kayod ngayon yung economic team on how to bring jobs back.
Let's now talk about the vaccine kasi alam naman nating lahat na yun na yung magiging solution, long-term solution dito. Sophia, can you give us like a brief timeline kung ano bang expected ng mga tao? Meron ba? Well, of course, may mga dumating na.
Well, meron naman. Yeah, meron naman. But like you said, it really all depends on when, right? The question has moved on from may dadating ba to like when will they actually come? And because of all the initial delays earlier in the year, a lot of people have been saying, I'm not going to believe any date that you give me until I see the airplane touch down on the tarmac and the vaccines have been unloaded from the cargo plane or whatever, or the cargo of the commercial airplane. So from what we know, no, the reason why the government seems so confident that it's going to still meet its target to vaccinate 70 million Filipinos is because by April or May, sometime starting the second quarter, that's an optimistic timeline, by the way. Supplies are supposed to be already starting to stabilize. And what we're seeing, or the hopeful scenario that's being painted right now, is that once bulk of vaccines start to arrive, then we can start quickly vaccinating a lot of people beyond just our healthcare workers and our senior citizens. And while all actually, come to think of it too, a lot of this brings back thoughts that I had earlier in the year and late last year na parang, okay, everything is written down on paper, but as we've seen in the last few weeks since we started rolling out our vaccines in March 1, is that sometimes, or no, most of the time, it doesn't go as planned, no. And I think one thing that I would like to see, for example, when we talk about a vaccine timeline and a plan, because the government is giving us all these timelines, all these projections on when vaccines are supposed to arrive and how they're going to roll them out. One thing that I would be interested to know right now is what are the best practices that we have seen so far from a month of rolling out these vaccines. We're fortunate that a lot of countries have, in a way, there are a lot of lessons to learn from countries who have gone before us. And then at the same time, the first sector to roll out these vaccines it's a very highly competent sector, the health sector. And so there are a lot of best practices and best lessons to learn to make sure that the succeeding months of our rollout are go as smoothly as the government wants it to go. So there's that. So yes, may vaccines naman na dadating, but at the same time, it really is just a matter of when and how well that will be rolled out once they actually arrive in the country.
Yun yung sanang next question ko na, so yung mga ordinary citizens, kailan kaya nila ma-expect dumating na mababakunahan sila? So we still don't have a definite answer to that.
Well, yung gusto ni Vaccine Czar Galvez is that by May, uh, normal people, I don't say normal people, but ordinary people who aren't part of, let's say, any priority sector can perhaps start getting vaccinated by May, June, when bulk of the vaccines start to arrive. Because what they want is to have simultaneous vaccinations, that instead of just focusing on sector per sector before you move to another one, if there's a lot of supply, then because private sector has bought their own supply, because LGUs have bought their own supply, then they should also, that should make access easier, and it should make vaccines more accessible to everyone. But the key there then is that it needs to be again studied by our medical experts and approved also by our national immunization, that the technical advisory group. Yeah, so we also have a expert panel that just basically studies the best and most ethical and most fair way to roll out very limited vaccines.
Yeah, and I
Pwede
just
ba?
wanna I just wanna
Sige,
jump
go.
in. I just wanna jump in there, no? Kasi yung private sector, frustrated na sila to the point na they wanna do their own vaccine rollouts. Parang the Philippine Chambers of Commerce and Industry, they want na bumili ng bakuna with no restrictions. Pero tandaan natin hindi pwede to kasi it's under an emergency use authorization, 'di ba? Kailangan dumaan pa rin yung government kaya tayo may tripartite agreement. But again, yung frustration ng businessmen is that basically parang pati ba naman last minute kasi, I mean yung talks na sign na deal for the vaccine was way back November 2020, right? And then yung expected na pagdating ng mga vaccines from AstraZeneca mga May or June. But now business leaders are anxious na baka ma-delay pa ito because lately lang sinabi na kailangan nyo makipag-team up pala. O eto si Zwilig. Kailangan nyo mag-team up for the vaccine rollouts, for the logistics, and all the other details for the vaccination program. So itong private sector basically hayaan nyo na kaming bumili. But again, as Sophia has explained in her various stories, hindi pwedeng ganun kasi yung bakuna kulang pa tayo ng yung datos ng bakuna, hindi pa ganun ka long term, ilang buwan lang yun, and there may be side effects that we don't know, right? So who's gonna cover that? That's exactly why naka-specify yung indemnification fund, right? So halimbawa pag nagkasakit yung binakunahan ng private sector, di ba, or nagkaroon ng side effects, who's gonna take care of that? Those are very big questions that the private sector has to keep in mind as well.
Pero 'di ba sa
Yes,
ibang bansa pwede eh. Yeah.
correct. That's why I was wondering. Maybe our chambers of commerce, but of course naka-deal na they were able to sign an agreement now with government. But Thailand and Indonesia, in Indonesia the chambers of commerce lobbied with Jokowi and he approved. So now they're able to buy directly vaccine sa Indonesia. Sa Thailand, ito nakakagulat. Pinayagan ng Thailand ang private hospitals to buy vaccines and to sell to the public aside from companies. So, ano ang pwedeng matutunan ng private sector sa experience ng Thailand and Indonesia? They've gone ahead and allowed the private sector to buy. Ang issue is equity. The private sector buys, so kanilang employees and the families and then the hospitals sell. So ang tingin ko, we should have parallel tracks. Isa government vaccination, isa private sector. Hindi naman hindi naman magkasalungat. So pwedeng sabay at saka we can cover more ground at saka mas mabilis.
Well, to add to what Mother and Ralph said, that brings back something that it makes me remember something that medical experts mentioned nung nakikita natin na baka may spike in cases ulit, because a lot of people were asking them, right? Like, are you gonna call another lockdown? I mean, the fact that people look to them for direction, no. But what struck me about what they said is that this is the Healthcare Professionals Alliance Against COVID-19, the same group that called for lockdown nga. The convener, Dr. Antonio Dance, was saying that, people can only do people have a really big role in bringing about change, whether that's the private sector lobbying for certain for more efficient processes, people following guidelines. But at the end of the day, big change and really lasting change comes from policymakers. Yung exact quote niya was, ang pagbabago sa lipunan malaking tungkulin ng mga taong bayan, pero nasa kamay ito ng ating mga policymakers. And for me, that struck me because right at the time the narrative was, you can't I think the narrative, we've seen it take shape in so many different forms, whether that would be something like Rambo mentioned, na parang when the LGUs come up with innovative solutions to improve contact tracing and coordinate with one another, because Metro Manila is so porous, the government said, don't do that. We have our own centralized app that you need to use. Or if the private sector is saying, practically begging to bring in vaccines, they're saying, no, you can't do all these things. And while there are many valid reasons for that, we don't see them, or we don't see them empowering or trying to look for solutions from what's already there, right? So parang if you have the private sector wanting to do this, and you have LGUs coming up with innovative solutions, at the end of the day, they can only do so much if the government won't let them, or if the national government doesn't actually make a better policies that actually instill some change in the way the pandemic is being handled.
So, nabanggit nyo yung competency, yung policy making, but is it too late now?
For
Or
me,
kaya
no.
pa ba?
I mean,
Huwag naman sana.
wag naman sana. And at the same time, I don't know, once this pandemic gonna end, right? So the worst thing to do would be to not do anything, or not to keep letting the opportunities pass by.
I think
So,
media and the public have to keep pressuring the government para ma-feel nila yung urgency. Like, actually, maganda yung sinulat ni Sophia. She did a schedule of arrivals and numbers of doses. Yun, pwedeng bantayan yon ng mga civil society or media, and to hold the government to account. You said this would arrive on this date. Moving targets eh. In fact, kinompute ko yung doses, number of millions of doses that Sophia wrote about. It will not be enough to vaccinate 70 million Filipinos by the end of the year. So I think we'll extend until next year. So delikado pa rin. I mean, it will still be fragile during campaign season in 2022.
Ralph, kasi parang nababasa natin ngayon online, sinasabi na, ang daming inuutang na pera, nasa ng bakuna. How do we reconcile that?
Well, kasi tandaan natin yung inutang lang is, so far we have 700 million, right? From the World Bank and the ADB. Tapos may paparating pa sa Asian, yung China-led AIIB. Yun lang yung sa bakuna. Yung ibang pera, yung mga inutang natin last year, ginamit na to sa pagtayo ng mga COVID-19 centers, sa pagbili ng mga PPE. I mean, to be honest, it's really hard to track kasi hindi naman natin natatrack to na parang, itong loan X na to ay $500 million na fully utilized na ba to? Hindi, it doesn't work that way kasi once it goes to the national treasury ay medyo mahirap na i-track yan. But for this year, no, so far the loans came in pretty early. So yung problema actually is na-procure ba natin or nakapag-secure na ba tayo? Yun yung tanong. Kasi mabilis na tayo yung unang-unang nakapag avail ng facility at the maximum amount ng ADB. And then on the same day naglabas din ng statement si World Bank na pinautang na rin tayo. So, and tandaan natin, I guess isa na rin to sa mga mga fears na yung baka makurakot lang. Hindi dadaan sa government yung specific na money for the vaccines. Ida-download lang immediately ng multilateral lenders doon sa kung sino man ang bibilhan natin ng bakuna. And tandaan natin, yung mga loans in particular, meron din standards yan. Hindi yan bibili kapag hindi kapag hindi na-meet yung mga standards ng vaccines. They're very specific when it comes to loans pagdating sa mga bakuna. Now, yung mga inutang natin from last year, I guess kailangan din nating balikan yun kung ano na ba yung utilization nun, di ba? So I guess yun lang yung fears. And let me also add, no, malaki na tayong inutang but we still have plenty of space to loan more. Yung problema kasi natin ngayon is we need to spend. Yun kasi yung kulang sa ekonomiya, no? We're a consumption-driven economy and the government is not spending enough. So yun yung medyo mahirap pa paintindi na parang billion na yung na we're getting dizzy with all these billions of pesos and dollars. But the truth is we actually need to spend more and we have plenty of room to borrow even more.
Bakit nga hindi mag-spend more? I'm sure
Kasi,
sumagot na dyan yung mga finance officials.
Yeah, kasi yung logic naman dyan ni Finance Secretary Sonny Dominguez is that the pandemic is not going away anytime soon. It's a marathon, parang ganun yung inaano nila. Pero sinasabi ng mga experts, it's not a marathon, it's a sprint. 'Di ba? So yun yung problema ngayon na parang marathon ba to or sprint, kaya parang nagrereserba sila na parang baka next year kailangan pa nating umutang ulit, kailangan hinay-hinay tayo sa fiscal space natin. But other economies, they're really spending hard, 'di ba? Na parang nagbibigay ng mga ayuda. The United States, pinag-uusapan kung magkano, di ba, magkano na ba yung binigay? $1,400, $1,400, right? Di ba, per person? Yun yung mga pinag-uusapan ngayon. For the budget, unfortunately for this year, we don't have programs for cash aid. Halimbawa, magka 1-month lockdown or a 2-week lockdown ulit, we're not gonna have money for that na naka-allocate. Maghahanap na naman sa unprogrammed funds. And, we're medyo ipit na talaga. Revenues natin are really down, 'di ba? Kasi maraming business na nagsasara, saan tayo kukuha ng mga buwis? So, 'di ba? Yun yung struggle and the dilemma, I think, ng economic team na kailangan nating kailangan natin silang kulitin na parang we're na parang may pangitain na magkaka-lockdown ulit and wala tayong pang-ayuda for that.
Sophia, I'm sure marami sa mga audience natin, sa mga listeners and viewers, ang interested to know more about Sinovac. Kasi ang controversial niya. Is it really ineffective ba siya? Or parang dahil from China, parang ganun na yung nagiging perception. So, lack of transparency?
Lack of transparency is really an issue, and I think that talking to a lot of medical experts about it, and just different people, anyone of whom could receive the vaccine or could have Sinovac be the vaccine that's available to them, isang malaking concern talaga ay yung transparency ng data and a lot of, and at the same time, I think that's one question that still lingers, no? Like, why hasn't the full data been published on a peer-reviewed journal? Because that would really appease a lot of people's concerns. But from what we understand so far, a lot of medical experts are very sober about it. They don't discount the possible benefits that Sinovac could give people, and the protection it can give some people against coronavirus. And particular to the Philippines, diba, isang detail was that the FDA's experts said that they did not recommend its use for health workers exposed to COVID-19. And of course, yung thinking ng mga tao is, well, if my doctor isn't going to receive it, then why would I? But talking to different doctors who've actually received it, knowing that there's that kind of recommendation, the way that they explained it to me was like this. And I think this is also something that really comforted me and made me understand why the rationale behind that kind of recommendation is because for a particular population like health workers exposed to COVID-19 and treating patients, the reportedly lower efficacy that Sinovac had from phase 3 trials in Brazil, which had health workers exposed to COVID-19 as participants. It was a very big trial. The efficacy there was lower, right, around 50.4. And so that's the reason why the FDA didn't recommend it for health workers, because that 50.4 efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19, it's really important for health workers because the slightest symptom you have, whether it be a cough or a painful throat, or you're feeling feverish, that means you can't go to work. And that means if you can't go to work, then you can't treat patients. And we know, of course, that the manpower for our health centers and hospitals is already so limited. So preventing symptomatic COVID-19, not just severe COVID-19, is really, really important. But at the end of the day, yun yung unang dumating, di ba? So a lot of health workers had to confront that question about whether or not they should take it. And a lot of it came down to time as well, because one day makes a difference for so many of them. Like if you're telling me that today I can have protection versus waiting an entire week where I can again get COVID, parang that was such a big I don't even know how to describe it, but it was such a huge thing for them. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to Sinovac, a lot of people are very wary about it. But I think that if we look at the example of our health workers, parang you could take some comfort in that. And at the same time, I remember talking to one medical expert, of an expert in vaccines, and she was saying, um, yes, it's a patient's right to choose a vaccine if they have, if they have that luxury. But for her, parang one of her goals at this point was to kind of drop the so-called biases against Sinovac, whether it be because it's made in China or anything. Because at the end of the day, we have to face the reality that parang it might be the most available vaccine to people who won't have any choice. And I think people have the responsibility to talk responsibly about it and make sure that they don't bring down confidence in or just talk about it carefully if they have concerns about it. But so far, a lot of the medical experts were saying that parang it's not the best, but it's available. And at the same time, I think we'll know more then when the Health Technology Assessment Council, which is talks about whether or not it would be a worth it buy with government, with taxpayers' money, and the ethics of it and everything. They'll give us a clearer picture. So goes back to yun nga, trusting our experts.
Yeah. And actually, parang, ewan ko if you'll agree with this, pero parang yung naging mentality ko, it's such a third world thing na parang kung ano na lang yung available, sige, yun na lang. Which is also sad kasi, di ba, it's our right also to choose. But yeah, kayo, anong last thoughts nyo dito sa vaccination? Mother?
Gusto ko na magpa-vaccinate.
Lahat tayo. Ako din eh.
It's really the waiting. At saka, I think I just wanted to add to what Ralph said, na talagang big time ang pagtulong ng private sector, di ba, Ralph? I think because of the AstraZeneca deal wherein 30 plus companies pooled resources, 700 million to buy 2.6 million doses, and they will give half to government and half for their employees. That's a big deal. But because nga of the weaknesses of that agreement, as you said, na wala palang logistics, wala pa palang delivery and distribution. So I think the second deal, led by Enrique Razon's consortium, improved on it, and his company will fund the logistics, the import, and government buys 13 million doses, and the private sector gets the rest of it, the rest of the 20 million. So ang laki ng tulong ng private sector, and that's why we're in the middle class, we have jobs. So hindi naman tayo umaasa na libre yung ating bakuna. As long as may access tayo, that's the most important thing.
Rambo, what about LGUs? Any last thoughts or info?
For vaccination, I mean, the LGUs already are at a bad start. I mean, mayors are documented today cutting ahead of the line. They are, of all the people na dapat tingnan ng mga tao anong dapat gawin, sila yung titingnan ng constituents, nasa yung vaccines namin. Sila pa talaga yung umuuna, na inuunahan pa yung health workers. And that's something that I believe is a story that we should continue on telling, and we will keep on telling yung accountability when it comes to the equity, as Mother said earlier. Itong vaccination, I mean, we know that it's coming, and it's a matter of when, but at the same time, these trickles that we are receiving, we have to work hard with reminding our government officials na talaga yung mga nakakailangan yung kailangan nilang unahin dito, hindi yung papayagan nila yung mga kung sino-sino na lang, yung mga mahalagang tao man makapangyarihan. At ito pa, hindi kailangan nating paalalahanan sila na mahigpit sila when it comes to enforcing their quarantine rules on the ground. Marami nang nakulong, as in talaga umaapaw ang kanilang mga police precincts, but at the same time, bakit yung kanilang application for enforcement of vaccine procedure, bakit hindi nila ma-enforce ng maayos? At ang mayor pang nahahanap nila, paano naman yung mga PSG na nakapakulong na lang una. So I think that's something that we should remind the government.
Right. Ralph, what about you?
Ako, siguro, I don't need to elaborate now on the numbers. It's pretty bad. The economy is really battered. We're reaching the limits na talaga. Parang wala nang mapipiga pa for this year. We need to bounce back na talaga, and it's gonna be the vaccines. But again, hindi pwedeng kanya-kanya. It has to be a whole of nation approach, 'di ba? Parang we need competent leaders, and the business community, I'm pretty sure, has had their lessons na kung sino mga sinuportahan nila in the previous elections. So I'm really looking forward. Makikichismis kung sino mga pupondohan ng mga to with the pandemic, di ba? I'm sure they were traumatized. Kasi grabe talaga ngayon. I mean, halimbawa, the biggest companies, wala talagang pinalusot eh. Talagang layoff kung layoff. Yung mga nakakausap kong mga executives, napakasakit sa kanila na mag-let go ng mga beloved nila mga empleyado, 'di ba? So and we can't even hug our yung mga nawala ng trabaho. They can't say goodbyes kasi virtual lang, Zoom or tawag lang. So this is economically, financially, socially, emotionally straining for all of us.
Sophia, our pandemic czar, any last thoughts?
Sige, just a few. I think going back to how you started the chat, I think vaccinations for one is one area that we can, see where we can actually start improving. Like there are concrete things that we can do, best practices we can learn from, whether that be looking at different countries, how they've done it, improving systems in place, tapping the private sector. Parang let's not waste this opportunity to help one another get back on our feet. But at the same time, I think I also just want to note that besides vaccination, parang one thing that I really hope our leaders and we demand for from our leaders also is to make sure that those lessons are actually translated into concrete changes in the end, whether that be beefing up our health system so that if a next pandemic comes, because you have experts saying that this won't be the last pandemic, we can't end up in this exact same situation that we're gonna go through the motion of trying to figure out how to respond to a disease, and then waiting for a vaccine, and then trying to get vaccine supplies, and thinking about money and time. Parang other than improving our vaccination program while we still can, while the rest of the population has yet to receive their shots, at the same time demanding from our and asking our government to make sure that you make the changes that we that we all need that we all need to happen, like what happened in Taiwan, like Mother said. Parang, let's not be scarred again a second time around, because that's too painful already.
Yeah. So, like, just to summarize what everyone said. So, this is not the time na magkanya-kanya because, hello, this is a pandemic. And if, alam mo yon, a certain group lang ang mabakunahan or ang maayos ang pagtrato, it will have an impact on the whole society. And we also need to have good and competent leaders. I think that's really the takeaway for the past year. We're just reiterating that. We have to hold them accountable. And most importantly, since we're going to enter a campaign season and election season, we really have to choose good leaders. So that's it for our Newsbreak Chats this month. Sana next month and next year, hindi na ganito. I'm Camila Lamia. Join us again next month for another episode.